It was a crisp autumn evening when the first incident occurred. Sarah and David had recently moved into an old Victorian house with their 5-year-old daughter, Emily. The house had a charming, albeit eerie appeal, with its creaky floorboards, antique furniture, and an attic that had been converted into a storage space. One night, Sarah woke up to a cold draft. She reached over to David, but he was sound asleep. She noticed that Emily's bedroom door was slightly ajar. Concerned, she got out of bed and walked to Emily's room, only to find her daughter's bed empty. Panic surged through her as she searched the house. Finally, she heard the faint sound of footsteps above her, coming from the attic. She climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under her weight. As she reached the top, she saw Emily standing in front of a small, dusty window. The moonlight illuminated her small frame, casting an eerie glow around her. "Emily," Sarah whispered, afraid to startle her. "What are you doing up here?" Emily turned slowly, her eyes wide and unseeing, her face blank. She was sleepwalking. Sarah gently led her back to bed, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. But over the next few weeks, the sleepwalking continued. Each time, Sarah or David would find Emily standing at the attic window, staring out into the darkness with an expression that was unsettlingly vacant. One night, Sarah decided to stay awake and keep an eye on Emily. She watched as her daughter got out of bed, her movements stiff and mechanical, and walked towards the attic. Sarah followed quietly, a sense of dread building within her. As Emily reached the attic, she went to the small window and stared out into the night once more. Sarah approached her cautiously. "Emily, sweetheart, what do you see out there?" Emily's voice was distant, almost robotic. "They're waiting for me." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who is waiting for you?" "The children. They want to play with me." Sarah shivered and gently guided Emily back to her bed, but sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, Sarah and David discussed the incidents, deciding to investigate the attic more thoroughly. They searched every corner, finding nothing but old boxes and forgotten belongings. However, near the small window, they discovered something chilling, an old, weathered children's book titled The Lost Children. The book contained illustrations of children playing in a forest, but as they turned the pages, the pictures grew darker. The children's faces became hollow, their eyes empty, and the forest twisted into something nightmarish. The final pages depicted the children standing at an attic window, much like the one in their house, their expressions eerily similar to Emily's sleepwalking face. Disturbed, Sarah and David decided to consult a sleep specialist, but the doctor found nothing physically wrong with Emily. Her sleepwalking episodes continued, growing more frequent and intense. Sarah began to notice other strange occurrences, whispers echoing through the house at night, shadows flitting at the edge of her vision, and the feeling of being watched. One night, as a storm raged outside, Sarah woke to find Emily's bed empty again. She rushed to the attic, but this time, Emily was not alone. She was standing at the window, holding hands with two ghostly figures, the children from the book. Their hollow eyes stared directly at Sarah, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. Sarah screamed and the figures vanished, leaving Emily standing alone, her eyes wide and vacant. She scooped Emily up and ran downstairs to find David. They decided they couldn't stay in the house any longer. They packed a few essentials and drove to a nearby motel, leaving the house dark and silent. The next morning, they contacted a real estate agent to put the house up for sale. They moved in with Sarah's parents temporarily, trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed. Emily's sleepwalking stopped, and the family began to feel a semblance of normalcy returning. However, one evening, Emily asked, "Mommy, when can we go back to play with the children?" Sarah's heart sank. "We're not going back to that house, sweetheart. The children weren't real." Emily looked at her mother with those wide, innocent eyes and said, "They're here too. They followed us." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her daughter's words pressing down on her. The house seemed too quiet. She got up to check on Emily and found her bed empty once again. Panic surged through her as she searched the house, finally hearing the faint sound of footsteps above her, coming from the attic in her parents' house. She climbed the narrow staircase, heart pounding. Emily was there, standing in front of a small window, staring out into the darkness. Sarah reached out to her, but before she could touch her, Emily turned, her eyes now hollow and empty, mirroring those of the ghostly children. "They're here," Emily whispered, "and they're not going to let us go." Sarah screamed for David, but when he reached the attic, Emily was gone, vanished without a trace. The house fell into a haunting silence, the echoes of Sarah's screams lingering in the air. They searched everywhere, called the police, but Emily was never found. Years later, the house remained empty, abandoned. Locals whispered about the family that had disappeared, and how on stormy nights, if you stood outside and listened closely, you could still hear the footsteps of a little girl in the attic, forever staring through the small window, waiting for the children who never left. When James inherited his grandparents' old house, he saw it as an opportunity to connect with his family's past. The house, a sprawling Victorian mansion nestled on the outskirts of a small town, had stood empty for years after his grandparents' passing. It was a house filled with memories, but also with secrets waiting to be uncovered. One rainy afternoon, as James was exploring the attic, he stumbled upon an old dust-covered trunk. Intrigued, he pried it open and found a treasure trove of family heirlooms, faded photographs, delicate porcelain figurines, and at the bottom, an old leather-bound diary. The diary's cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. He carefully picked it up and opened it, revealing the elegant handwriting of his grandmother, Eleanor. James took the diary downstairs, settling into a cozy armchair by the fireplace. The rain pattered against the windows as he began to read. The early entries were mundane, detailing daily life and family gatherings, but as he turned the pages, the tone of the diary shifted. Eleanor wrote of strange occurrences in the house, odd noises, fleeting shadows, and an ever-growing sense of unease. One entry in particular caught his attention. June 15, 1947. "Something is wrong. Last night I heard whispers coming from the walls, but when I asked Charles, he said he heard nothing. It felt as though the house itself was speaking to me, its voice filled with sorrow. I feel watched, even when I am alone." James felt a chill run down his spine. He continued reading, the entries becoming increasingly disturbing. Eleanor wrote of waking up to find objects moved, of cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and of a sense that something was lurking just out of sight. September 3, 1947, I found a strange mark on the wall today, near the basement door. It looks like a symbol of some kind, but I cannot find its meaning. I fear this house holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. Curiosity piqued, James decided to investigate the basement. He had always avoided it, finding the dark, damp space unnerving. Armed with a flashlight, he made his way down the creaky stairs. The basement was cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. He searched the walls until he found it, the symbol his grandmother had described. It was carved into the wall, a strange, intricate design that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As he stared at the symbol, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, and he heard faint whispers echoing through the basement. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of his eye. Heart pounding, he backed away and hurried up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. That night, James found it difficult to sleep. He kept hearing strange noises, a soft, rhythmic tapping, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He told himself it was just the old house settling, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The next day he continued reading the diary. The entries became more frantic, filled with fear and desperation. October 12, 1947. I cannot bear it any longer. The whispers have grown louder, and I feel as though I am being watched at every moment. Last night, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed, but when I turned on the light, it vanished. I fear for my sanity. James was determined to uncover the truth. He spent hours researching the history of the house, but found little information. Desperate for answers, he reached out to a local historian who specialized in the town's history. The historian, an elderly man named Mr. Clark, agreed to meet with him. Over tea in Mr. Clark's cluttered study, James shared the diary and his experiences. Mr. Clark listened intently, his expression growing more grave with each passing minute. "This house," Mr. Clark began, has a dark history. It was built in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Blackwood. He was a recluse, known for his interest in the occult. There were rumors of strange rituals and dark ceremonies held in the basement. People said he was trying to summon something that should never have been brought into this world. James felt a knot form in his stomach. What happened to him? He disappeared without a trace, Mr. Clark replied. Some say he succeeded in his summoning, but could not control what he had brought forth. Others believe he became a victim of his own dark practices. The house has been sold many times since then, but no one stays for long. The stories of hauntings and strange occurrences persist to this day. Returning to the house, James felt a growing sense of unease. That night, as he lay in bed, the noises began again. Whispers, tapping, footsteps. He decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. Grabbing his flashlight, he made his way to the basement. The symbol on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. As he approached it, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. He reached out and touched the symbol, and the air around him seemed to shimmer. Suddenly, the basement was plunged into darkness, and a cold, oppressive presence filled the room. James heard a voice, clear and cold, echoing in his mind. "You should not have come here." Terrified, he tried to pull away, but his hand was stuck to the wall, as if held by an invisible force. The shadows around him coalesced into a figure, tall and dark, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. "Who are you?" James whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "I am bound to this place, brought forth by the one who built it. You have awakened me, and now you will suffer as he did." The basement seemed to close in around James, the air growing colder and heavier. He felt an icy hand grip his shoulder, and he screamed. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the symbol on the wall, glowing brighter and brighter until it burned into his vision. The next morning, the house stood silent and still. The neighbors, having heard James's screams, called the authorities. They found the house empty, the basement door ajar. The symbol on the wall had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. James was never seen again, his disappearance adding to the dark legend of the house. Years later, the house remains abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its once beautiful facade now crumbling. The townspeople avoid it, speaking of the curse that haunts it. And on stormy nights, if you stand outside and listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of the lost souls trapped within its walls, forever bound by the darkness that lies beneath. It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah and Michael moved into their new home, a quaint cottage on the edge of a dense forest. The house had a charm that had instantly captivated them, with its old-fashioned architecture and the smell of pine trees wafting through the open windows. They spent the first few weeks painting, rearranging furniture, and making the house their own. Everything was perfect until the footsteps began. One night, long after they had settled into bed, Sarah woke to a faint sound. She listened intently, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, soft, measured footsteps above her head. She nudged Michael awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's probably just the house settling. Old houses make all kinds of noises." Sarah tried to believe him, but the footsteps continued every night, growing louder and more persistent. She could no longer ignore them. They were too deliberate, too human. One particularly cold night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps had started again, moving slowly from one end of the attic to the other. Unable to bear it any longer, she got out of bed and crept up the narrow staircase leading to the attic. Michael followed close behind, armed with a flashlight. The attic was a cavernous space filled with dusty old furniture and forgotten relics. The air was cold and musty, and the wooden floorboards creaked under their weight. They scanned the room with the flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The footsteps had stopped as soon as they entered, leaving only an oppressive silence. "See? Nothing here," Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Reluctantly, they returned to their bedroom, but sleep did not come easily. The next few nights were eerily quiet. Sarah began to hope that whatever had been causing the noises had moved on. But one night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent than before. They seemed to echo through the house, filling every corner with their relentless rhythm. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Sarah and Michael decided to investigate the history of the house. They visited the local library and dug through old records and newspapers. What they found sent chills down their spines. The house had once belonged to a reclusive man named Samuel Grayson. He had lived there alone for many years, rarely seen by the townspeople. According to the records, Samuel had disappeared mysteriously one winter, leaving no trace behind. The townspeople believed he had gone mad and wandered into the forest, never to be seen again. But there were rumors, whispers of strange rituals and dark deeds that had taken place in the attic. With a growing sense of dread, Sarah and Michael returned home. That night, the footsteps were louder than ever, accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Desperation drove them to confront whatever haunted their home. Armed with a crowbar, they returned to the attic and began to search every inch of the space. As they pried up floorboards and moved old furniture, they uncovered a hidden door beneath a pile of dusty blankets. The door was small, almost child-sized, and locked with a heavy iron padlock. Michael forced the lock open with the crowbar, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The air that wafted out was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. They hesitated, but the footsteps and whispers drove them forward. The passageway led to a small, hidden room. The walls were lined with strange symbols and the remnants of burned candles. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, and sitting in the chair was a life-sized doll, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. The doll was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and its porcelain face was cracked and discolored. As they stepped closer, they noticed a journal lying at the doll's feet. Sarah picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to Samuel Grayson and detailed his descent into madness. He wrote of hearing footsteps in the attic, of whispers that drove him to the brink of insanity. In his final entries, he spoke of a ritual to trap the spirits that haunted him, using the doll as a vessel. The footsteps returned, louder and more frenzied, echoing through the narrow passageway. The doll's glass eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, and the whispers grew louder, forming words that chilled them to the bone. "Free me." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, and the temperature dropped sharply. The whispers turned to screams, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The doll's mouth moved, and a guttural voice emerged. "You cannot escape." Panic set in, and they ran towards the attic door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were all around them now, closing in. Sarah clutched the journal, desperate to find a way to end the nightmare. "Find the key," the voice whispered, "and release me." With trembling hands, Sarah searched the hidden room and found a small, rusted key hanging from a hook on the wall. She knew what she had to do. She approached the doll, the key clutched tightly in her hand. As she inserted the key into a small lock on the back of the doll, the room grew deathly silent. The doll's eyes rolled back, and it let out a piercing scream. The attic door flew open, and a gust of wind extinguished the candles. They fled the attic, the screams and footsteps fading behind them. In the safety of their bedroom, they could still hear the faint echoes of the horrors they had unleashed. They knew they could never truly escape the darkness that had taken hold of their home. The next morning, they packed their belongings and left the house, vowing never to return. But as they drove away, Sarah glanced back and saw a figure standing in the attic window, watching them leave. They never spoke of what happened, but the memory haunted them for the rest of their lives. The house remained empty, a dark presence lingering within its walls. And on quiet nights, the townspeople claimed they could still hear the footsteps, pacing endlessly in the attic, forever seeking release. When Emily and Jack bought the old Victorian house on the edge of town, they were captivated by its timeless beauty and the stories it seemed to whisper through its weathered walls. The previous owners had passed away, and the house had stood vacant for years. As they settled in, the couple took pleasure in exploring every nook and cranny, delighting in the hidden gems they discovered in their new home. One rainy afternoon, while rummaging through the attic, Emily stumbled upon something unusual. The attic was a large, dusty space filled with forgotten relics and old furniture covered in white sheets. As she pushed aside a stack of boxes, she noticed an odd gap in the wooden paneling. Curious, she brushed away the cobwebs and discovered a small, almost imperceptible door, its edges seamlessly blended into the wall. "Jack, come here!" she called, excitement and apprehension mingling in her voice. Jack climbed the creaky stairs and joined her, his eyes widening at the sight. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know, but it looks like it's been hidden for a long time," Emily replied, running her fingers along the edges of the door. They managed to pry the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and something else, something older and more unsettling. They exchanged uneasy glances, but were both too intrigued to turn back. Grabbing a flashlight, Jack led the way, Emily close behind. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the air grew colder as they descended. The passageway seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until they reached a heavy wooden door at the bottom. Jack hesitated before pushing it open. The room beyond was vast and surprisingly well preserved. It was a large, circular chamber with stone walls and an intricately patterned floor. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty tomes and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood an ancient-looking stone altar, its surface covered with strange symbols and stains that looked disturbingly like old blood. Emily shivered, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "What is this place?" Jack shook his head, equally bewildered. "It looks like some kind of ritual chamber." As they explored the room, they found more unsettling items. Old, yellowed scrolls written in an unknown language, jars filled with dark, viscous liquids, and strange, twisted figures carved from bone. On one of the shelves, Emily discovered a leather-bound journal. She opened it, revealing page after page of detailed accounts of rituals and ceremonies performed in the chamber. The last entry was dated over 100 years ago and described a summoning ritual that had gone terribly wrong. Jack examined the altar, noting the deep grooves carved into its surface. "This place gives me the creeps. We should leave." But Emily was transfixed by the journal, her eyes wide with a mix of fascination and horror. "Wait, listen to this. It says they tried to summon something from another realm, but they couldn't control it. It says the door must remain sealed, for it binds the darkness within." Just then, a low, rumbling noise echoed through the chamber. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to get out of here," Jack said urgently, grabbing Emily's arm. They hurried back up the narrow stairs, the sound of the rumbling growing louder behind them. As they reached the attic, the small door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. They backed away, breathless and terrified, the sound of the rumbling fading into an oppressive silence. Over the following days, strange things began to happen in the house. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed by themselves, and at night, they heard whispers and footsteps echoing through the halls. The once welcoming house now felt hostile, its very walls seeming to close in on them. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had unleashed something from the hidden chamber. She pored over the journal, trying to find a way to undo whatever had been set in motion. But the more she read, the more hopeless it seemed. The rituals described were dark and complex, requiring items and knowledge they didn't possess. One night, as a storm raged outside, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jack lit candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. They huddled together in the living room, fear tightening its grip around their hearts. Suddenly, the small door in the attic burst open with a deafening crash. The rumbling returned, louder and more violent than before. The entire house shook, and a cold, unnatural wind swept through the rooms, extinguishing the candles. In the darkness, they saw shapes moving, twisted figures emerging from the shadows. "Run!" Jack shouted, pulling Emily towards the front door. But as they reached the hallway, the floorboards splintered and cracked. A deep, gaping chasm opened up beneath them, and they fell into the darkness below. They landed hard in the ritual chamber. The air knocked from their lungs. The altar glowed with a sickly green light, and the shadows around them coalesced into a towering, nightmarish figure. The figure's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its voice echoed in their minds, filling them with despair. "You have freed me. Now you shall pay the price." Emily and Jack tried to scramble away, but the darkness closed in around them, its cold tendrils wrapping around their limbs, pulling them towards the altar. They screamed, their voices merging with the whispers that filled the chamber, their bodies disappearing into the void. The house stood silent once more, its secrets hidden behind walls and doors. The attic door remained open, a silent invitation to the next unwitting souls who would dare to explore its depths. And on stormy nights, if you stood outside and listened closely, you could still hear their screams, echoing from the darkness below, forever trapped in the nightmare they had unleashed.